Hi, welcome to the Personal History Hub. This video is all about, it's a Cold War content video, the fifth one. It's all about the creation of the satellite states in Eastern Europe, or as we've discussed in previous videos, it's also known as Stalin's buffer zone in Eastern Europe. So how and why did the USSR occupy nations in Eastern Europe? Let's start with that first. So in 1944 and 1945, the Soviet Red Army freed many countries in Eastern Europe from Nazi occupation as it advanced west towards Germany. When the war was over, so when we say the war, we mean World War II, when World War II was over, Stalin was reluctant to give up control of these countries as they were a useful buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Germany. He turned them into what's called satellite states, with communist governments and little genuine independence from the Soviet Union. Truman saw this as evidence that the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism worldwide and relations between the USA and the Soviet Union became worse. So these different countries in Eastern Europe, they weren't necessarily part of the Soviet Union, but they had communist governments that were very heavily influenced by Stalin and by the Soviet Union. And it therefore gave Stalin a little bit of a kind of buffer zone, a kind of gap in between his borders, the USSR borders, and the borders of Western Europe, just in case of attack. So Soviet actions in these satellite states always followed the same pattern. They would start by setting up coalition governments in which the communists shared power with other political parties. Backed by Stalin, the communists would then take over the civil service, the media, security, and defence. And opposition leaders were arrested or forced to flee. Elections were held, but were fixed to ensure support for the communists. People's democracies were then set up. However, they were not democracies at all. So please don't get confused between a country that's called a people's democracy and an actual democracy. So how did Britain and the US actually react to Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe? So the countries essentially taken by the Soviets and therefore becoming Soviet satellite states by 1948 included Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary. All of these countries now looked to Moscow for direction. This was not the democracy that the Western Allies had hoped for, so what they'd actually agreed on at the conferences in and towards the end of World War II. So Britain and the USA were alarmed by Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe. Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed that Eastern Europe should be a Soviet sphere of influence and that Stalin would heavily influence the region. However, they had not expected such complete Soviet domination, and they were convinced that the democratically elected governments, which would have also remained friendly to the Soviet Union, could have been set up in each country. This is when the major differences began to develop, and Stalin believed that he could only ensure the support of the countries of Eastern Europe by setting up Soviet-controlled communist governments. US President Truman saw this as a blatant attempt by Stalin to spread communism throughout Europe. Okay, so just having a quick look at this map, the kind of dark red bit on the right is the Soviet Union. So there's the borders of the Soviet Union. Okay, then we've got all of the satellite states. So Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. There was also Yugoslavia and Albania, but Yugoslavia cut ties with the Soviet Union in 1948 and Albania do so in 1960. Okay, so you can see that this buffer zone, or the satellite states, also known as the Eastern Bloc in some cases, provided Stalin with a big gap, okay, in between himself, the Soviet Union, and the Western nations over here, which were aligned with the US and Britain. So let's have a look at some of these countries in a bit more detail. So we'll start with Hungary. So the largest party in 1945 in Hungary was the Smallholders Party, which won over 50% of the vote in the elections of August 1945. However, the country began to experience an economic crisis, and the Communist Party was able to seize control of the Ministry of the Interior, which controlled the police. They used this control to great effect in 1947, arresting Bela Kovacs, the leader of the Smallholders Party. The Prime Minister, Imre Nagy, was forced to resign. In the general election of August 1947, the Communists secured a large share of the vote and took over the government. All other parties were then banned. So in Czechoslovakia, the Communists already had great support in Czechoslovakia, and by 1947 they were the largest party in the coalition government and controlled the police and armed forces. In 1948, supported by the Soviet Union, they used the army to seize control of the country. Many non-communists were arrested, and the Foreign Secretary, Jan Masaryk, a non-communist, was murdered. Rigged elections brought a communist victory. Soon after, all other political parties were banned. So we're starting to follow the same pattern here for each country. So Poland, again, similar pattern. So in June 1945, a coalition government of several parties is set up in Poland. In January 1947, elections were rigged to ensure the election of a totally communist government, and the leader of the main opposition party fled to London. So Romania, again, a very similar pattern as outlined before. So as with Poland, a coalition government was set up in early 1945. Then in January 45, the communists, encouraged by Stalin, took part in demonstrations to disrupt the government. Finally, in March 1945, the Soviet army intervened. It disarmed the Romanian army and forced the king to appoint a government dominated by the communists under Petru Groja. In November 1946, elections were held and the communists gained 80% of the vote. In the following year, the communist government abolished the monarchy as well. Okay, thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Personal History Hub.